Marvel Legends line has been going strong since 2002 under Toy Biz. It's had a few wobbles across the years, most notably obviously when it changed hands to Hasbro in 2006. There was a few choppy years there where things were less than perfect. But since about 2013, the line has just gone from strength to strength, and I feel that each year it seems to get better and stronger and more diverse. It seems like we've got to a place now where Hasbro are able to give us an incredible amount of characters that have not previously been thought of or never have been considered a top tier character, a character that needed to have a lot of cachet, a lot of comic sales, or have its own movie. And now we're seeing all sorts of incredible characters, B characters, C-list characters, characters that have been long forgotten but are much loved by a loyal fan base. We've even got to the point where we're seeing figures of Squirrel Girl and Frogman. So it really feels now like anything is possible in this line, which is just as well because despite having produced an incredible amount of figures across all those years, there is still a lot of characters that have yet to see life in plastic form. So I've been thinking about some of the characters that I would like to see made. I thought I'd made a quick list, but actually, as I started to make it, it started to grow and grow and grow as I thought of other characters and remembered some from my youth that I was very fond of, and I realised I was going to have to do two videos. I'm going to have to separate this out between the heroes and the villains. And so in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at the heroes. First up, I have Stingray. This is a character that's been bobbing around the Marvel Universe for a long time now. Believe it or not, his origins go back to the 1960s, and he's primarily conceived as being an underwater hero. He's a character who will often appear next to the Submariner or Iron Man when he's in his Hydro armour, and somehow he's always managed to hang around the periphery of the Marvel Universe. You'd think he might be a one-trick pony, he might show up and then be forgotten, but he does seem to reoccur in almost every era. And I think a lot of that comes down purely to his look, because I think he has an absolutely fantastic design. I love the colour combination of the red and the white, but it's really those wings that really make him really striking and appealing. And I think there's something about not having a descript face, that we can't really see eyes or a nose or a mouth, that makes him mysterious and interesting. And I think he'd make an absolutely fantastic figure as well. I think he'd look really good in the collection. I think he does have that visual aesthetic that is really appealing. So yeah, I think he would be a big hit on the toy shelves. At number 9, I have Johnny Blaze. Now, Johnny Blaze was the original Ghost Rider. When that series wrapped up in the very early 80s, the character was rested for nearly a decade. When the title did relaunch in the early 90s, it was with a brand new Ghost Rider, which was Daniel Ketch. But during this new relaunch, Johnny Blaze was reintroduced into the continuity, and he was now Johnny Blaze free from the demon Zarathos, and was just a fully human stunt motorcyclist. However, after an encounter with the new Ghost Rider, Johnny Blaze was imbued with new mystical powers, which primarily meant he could fire hellfire from a shotgun. This version of Johnny Blaze was more jaded, more cynical, more hard-nosed, tough guy action hero. And the popularity of this character meant he was a reoccurring character in the Ghost Rider title, and eventually had his own spin-off, Spirits of Vengeance, that co-starred Ghost Rider, before even launching his own solo title. In the fullness of time, Johnny Blaze would go on to re-inhabit the Ghost Rider mantle himself, and that would open a whole new era some years later. But I have a lot of love for this incarnation of the character. It was the 90s in which I was introduced to Ghost Rider and formed a real strong love for this character, and I really enjoyed the partnership with Johnny Blaze, and he was a significant part of that team up. So for me, this is how I always think of Johnny Blaze in my mind's eye. And I'd love to be able to add another character, another figure to my Midnight Suns. We have Morbius from this era, we have Ghost Rider, we have Vengeance. It'd be really nice to have a 90s Johnny Blaze in there as well. And he sports two different looks during this era, so you've got a choice. You've got his classic look there with the shades and the ponytail, or you can go for his later look, which had more of the cybernetic faceplate and short leather jacket. I'd be happy with either, but my preference would be for the first look. And I think this would be an easy contender for one of those rider sets where he'd come with his bike as well. I think this would be a deluxe figure and could be really, really cool. Number 8, I have Diamondback. This is a character that seems to have largely disappeared from the Marvel Universe. I understand she's had a few appearances in recent years, but she doesn't seem to be as prominent as she once was, as she was a sort of co-star in the Captain America books back in the very late 80s and very early 90s. She was Captain America's girlfriend, and she was sort of an anti-hero turned good. And at the time, I thought they had quite a compelling relationship, and I quite liked this character, especially as her origin had her being part of the villainous Serpent Society. And I always thought the costume was kind of colourful and fun, and I think it'd just be a really nice addition to have some representation for Captain America from this period, really. The only thing we really have to represent him at the moment is the Catwalk figure, which I do think was a great touch. I really love that they put that out there. And of course, we do also have Crossbones. And it'd be really nice to just complement that by having something like Diamondback in the collection. Okay, so number 7 is a little bit of a left field choice. I've opted for Killraven. This is a little bit out there because Killraven isn't really connected with the rest of the Marvel Universe. He's kind of off on his own really for most of the time. He does span out of the War of the Worlds comic, before it was retitled with him as the eponymous hero. And he was given a little bit of a comic book makeover in terms of his costume. The character's heyday, of course, was back in the 1970s, but he has managed to hang in there, and he's had a couple of more recent appearances in the Marvel Universe as well. So this isn't a completely forgotten character, but he is very much on the sidelines. I think for me personally, I just really like the design of this character. There's something very exciting and visceral about all of his covers. They just seem really fun. And there's just something about him that I think would lend itself perfectly to action figure form. And I know if they made one, I would definitely grab it. And I think part of the appeal for me is just that he is so different to everything else in the collection. I think he'd be really, really cool to have. And I think he'd sit quite nicely along some of those other characters like this, like Conan, for example. Another character that seems to have been largely forgotten is the Swordsman. This is a character again who can trace his origins back all the way to the 1960s, when of course he's introduced as a villain for the Avengers. In the fullness of time, much like Hawkeye and Black Widow before him, he actually is converted to the side of good and actually becomes an Avenger. This is short-lived, but he actually has quite a memorable presence on the team, and it comes to quite an interesting conclusion. So I won't say any more, I won't give out any spoilers, but I do think he's an interesting character that really deserves a bit more love and attention. He's had a couple of different looks throughout the years, but they've all remained largely consistent in terms of colour scheme, and I think whatever design you went with, he's quite a colourful, interesting character, and I don't think you can do better than any character that has a sword. They're instantly cool. At number 5, I've got Drax the Destroyer in his classic costume. Now, as much as I've tried to steer away from variants and promote new characters rather than just different costumes of established characters in the line, I do think it'd be really nice to have a classic Drax, because he's so different to the modern version that we have. And for me personally, this is how I think of Drax in my mind's eye. This is how I envision him. I don't really associate him with the films or with his more modern look. This is how I think of him. So I'd really love to have this version in my collection. I grew up reading the Silver Surfer comics of the 90s, and Drax was a huge part of that, and he was so wonderfully drawn by Ron Lim, and I really want to have that on my shelf. And I think it's actually fairly surprising that we haven't had him already, given obviously the success of the Guardians of the Galaxy. I would have thought that we would have had a classic version by now, so it's a shame that we don't. And I think there's a couple of different looks that he has during his time. There's a much more slimmed down look, and then there's a much beefier look. Again, for me personally, I would want the much beefier one. So he could be potentially a deluxe figure. That would be quite nice. And it would be really fun to complete a lineup of the galactic figures from this time. We have a lot of these characters now, so it'd be wonderful to add a classic Drax in there as well. At number 4, we're back to being a little bit more obscure, and I've gone for Solo. Solo is a heavily armed, no-nonsense mercenary, and he's very similar to the Punisher in a lot of ways, except obviously he's paid to do a job. He first shows up in the very early 90s, and he seems to hang around and run into Spider-Man quite a lot during those days. He's had a mini-series or two, but he's never really had an ongoing title, and he's mostly been a supporting star in other people's books. But he's managed to hang in there across the years, and we've seen him pop up in more recent years as well. I've always really liked the design of this character. I think the green costume's always been really cool, and I just love that he's loaded down with loads and loads of grenades and guns and knives and everything you can think of. I just think it's a really fun look, and again, I think it would complement figures like the Punisher and Spider-Man in our collection. I think it'd look really, really good. Another Another character that's been largely ignored over the years is Dr. Druid. Again, I think he'd be a really interesting character to throw into the mix. Like Doctor Strange, he's more of a mystical sorcerer, and he can vary between being a hero or villain depending on what you're reading. But for a time, he was one of the Avengers. And his story arc is quite interesting when you read those comics from the late 80s. And like everyone in the Marvel Universe, he has of course sported a few different looks across the years. So potentially there's a choice of different outfits they could put him in, different looks he could have in figure form. But I think his most recognisable is in the purple robe and the red leotard. And I think this would nicely round out our Supernatural collection, really. It'd be a nice one to have in there and have him alongside Doctor Strange. He's definitely an interesting character and visually quite cool as well. In second place, I have Volstagg, and honestly, I'm surprised that they haven't made a figure of him already. Volstagg, of course, has his origins all the way back to the beginning of the Marvel Universe, hanging out with Thor and the Warriors 3. And in some regards, he is a bit of a silly character. Obviously, he's enormously huge, and there's a lot of jokes made at his expense. But he's a deceptively fierce warrior, and he's incredibly brave, and of course, very, very strong as well. And he's one of those larger-than-life, fun, interesting characters that supports Thor. And there's something instantly memorable about the character, whether it's his very bright, colourful costume, or just the sheer size of the character on the page. There's something interesting and attention-grabbing about him. So I think he'd make an absolute fantastic deluxe figure. I think he could be a builder figure, potentially, or even better would be to release a special 3-pack where we could have the Warriors 3 in all their glory. I think this would be a huge hit. It would be a must-have, surely. And I'm only surprised that we haven't seen these characters come to life yet in the line. Okay, my number one is Doc Samson. Now, again, I'm breaking my own rules here because I did promise myself that I would only pick new characters that we haven't seen in figure form before for this list. But I've got to be honest, every time they make an announcement that there's a new Marvel Legends figure coming out, I always secretly hope that it's this one. Doc Samson is one of those characters that's been around the Marvel Universe for a long time. He's been a supporting character for the Incredible Hulk, and he has a really interesting history, both as hero and villain, and I've always just thought he's just really, really cool, because at the end of the day, anyone who can go toe-to-toe with the Hulk kind of has to be. Now, he's had a couple of different costumes across the years. We've seen this one in figure form before. Sadly, it wasn't that easy to get hold of, so although he's already technically in the line, it would be lovely to have an updated version of this figure. Or, even better, the alternative costume. Honestly, I would be happy with either of them. And I think we're long overdue a revisit to this character, really. I'm sure it's only a matter of time before we do get a dedicated Hulk wave of Marvel Legends, and surely he has to be in it. So I've got my fingers crossed. I really, really do want to see him again. He will be at the top of my list for any list to have in Marvel Legends. I've got to have my Doc Samson at some point. So there you have it, there's my top 10. This was a really, really, really difficult list to narrow down. I've been adding characters and crossing them off and re-editing this video several times as I've been trying to get to grips with it. There's a whole universe of characters that we've yet to see in figure form, and I think it's only fair that I throw in a few honourable mentions that came very close to being on this list. First up, we have the Monica Rambeau Captain Marvel. Again, a much loved character, a character that was Captain Marvel in the 1980s, part of the Avengers, and another surprising omission from a Marvel Legends line. The fact that she hasn't been made before is really, really strange when we think about it. But ultimately, I decided to not include her on the list because I thought, well, it's inevitable that she is going to get made. I think we have that upcoming movie, The Marvels, of which I'm sure she's going to be a part, and I think then we'll definitely get a whole slew of different versions of this character. I also had Silver Fox on my list. Silver Fox is a character that was very important to the Wolverine mythos in the early 90s, and was quite an enigmatic, interesting character. But it feels like as soon as the Wolverine mystery was unravelled over time, that her importance and her role in that story just kind of dissipated, and she didn't really seem strong enough to stand on her own, so we haven't seen much of her since, and it's for that reason really that I didn't include her in the list in the end. Another couple of Avengers that seems to have been forgotten about is Giant Man and Black Knight. Now, we do have more traditional variants of these characters based on their classic outfits, and that's absolutely fair and appropriate, but I do think we've forgotten about their 90s looks. And right now, it seems like Hasbro is returning their attention to the 90s and really catering for that. We've seen a lot of retro packaging lately, and some of these more obscure characters that only really existed in this decade. So I think it would be really, really cool to finally have a giant man in this costume, as well as a Black Knight with his leather jacket and his flaming sword. Another variant I have affection for would be Punisher 2099. Now, obviously the 2099 series is much maligned, it's not fondly remembered, but I do think a few fun things came out of that line, such as Spider-Man 2099 and the Punisher 2099, because I think there's something really cool about his costume, having the ordnance, but obviously in a science fiction kind of setting. It just adds a little bit more oomph, a bit more fun to it, and I think it would make for a great toy. I think it'd be an absolutely fantastic figure to have loaded down with all kinds of extra goodies. It could be a lot of fun. You could go the extra mile and give him his bike as well, so he could be a deluxe figure, or you could pack him in as a 2-pack and throw in Vendetta as well. And then honestly, one of the figures I really, really desperately want to see is the Hydro Armor Iron Man. Now, I didn't put him on the list because I didn't just want to have loads of variants of the same characters, and Iron Man has had so many over the years, it's getting ridiculous. But I think this is, again, a legitimately different kind of figure. Like, it would be a completely different mold, it's a very different design, and I think it's a really interesting, good look for the character. And I think it's one that's fondly remembered. It's been revitalised a few times in the comic books, but of course it also had a strong presence in the animated cartoon. It had its own figure from Toy Biz back in the 90s, and I just think it's a great look, and I think it'd be really, really cool. It's something that's missing from the Hall of Armour, because we've had so many variants. Let's get this one in there, and I think, you know, we'd have a pretty full collection then. I hope you enjoyed the vid. If you did, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as I'll be posting more videos soon.